Ken Lee and his wingman were flying their OV-1 Mohawks at 2,000 feet over thick jungle just south of the DMZ. Suddenly, Lee felt a series of thumps on the rear of his aircraft. Having been hit by ground fire and injured in this area only weeks before, Lee had no intention of hanging about. He told his wingman to break south and started a right turn to put some distance between himself and the AAA batteries in the valley. Heavily loaded, he only had 170 knots of airspeed. As he looked out the right side of the Mohawk to clear his turn, a snub-nosed fighter flew right by him, overshooting the slow-flying Mohawks and turning to re-engage. For a moment, Lee thought he was looking at one of the Australian CA-27 Sabres that were deployed to Ubon, but then he saw the red star on its tail and heard his wingman shouting that he had a MiG on him. In a matter of moments, Ken Lee was going to become one of the Vietnam War's unlikeliest and least heralded MiG killers. The OV-1 Mohawk's development journey was remarkably complicated and political for what was ultimately rather a modest and utilitarian aircraft. In late 1954, the US Army issued a requirement for a high-performance aircraft to be used for observation, artillery spotting, and general utility use. Even in these early days, the specification called for a multi-service aircraft, as the Marines needed to replace the Cessna OE-1, and it seemed prudent to kill two birds with one stone. 6 companies proposed designs against this requirement. Having processed them, the Army submitted a formal specification for approval by the Department of Defense in March 1956, and they immediately encountered politics and inter-service rivalry. The Air Force was still a relatively new service at this point, but it was already a jealous guardian of its territory. They had pushed the DoD to opine on the subject of Army ownership of fixed-wing aircraft, ostensibly to prevent duplication of procurement between the two services. This process was ongoing when the Army specification was pushed up the chain. Based on the DoD's study, Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson decided to place a £5,000 weight limit on Army aircraft. That's a pretty small aeroplane. The last US Army Air Force combat aircraft to come in under that limit was the Boeing P-26, which first flew in 1932 and entered service in 1933. For this reason, the Army requested 2 exceptions to the weight limit. The first was the DHC-4 Caribou. The second was the proposed observation aircraft. DoD approved both exceptions. During June 1956, the Army issued their specification to industry. It was for a 2-seat, twin-engine, turboprop aircraft able to operate from unprepared fields in all weather conditions. The Navy, operating on behalf of the Marines, wanted the aircraft to be able to operate from escort carriers, so this requirement was also included. In March 1957, Grumman was declared the prime contractor for the program, the resulting aircraft from which was then known as G-134. A different form of inter-service tension now erupted. The Navy reasonably wanted to have its say in the G-134 specification. It was also essentially Grumman's only customer and therefore able to exert powerful influence over the company. Unfortunately, the Army and the Navy wanted different things out of the aircraft. The Marines really wanted a basic, extremely rugged observation aircraft that could also provide close support. The Army had loftier ambitions. They wanted something equipped with sophisticated radar and infrared sensors and powerful radios that could spot for heavy, long-ranged and potentially nuclear-tipped artillery and short-range missile batteries. Armament wasn't essential, as a 203mm shell with a nuclear warhead sends its own message. G-134 therefore featured weapons pylons. The Air Force absolutely hated this, and because in this period they tended to act like spoiled kids, they whined to the DoD. They even demanded that Grumman stop publishing company brochures advertising the aircraft's attack potential. All 4 services were now involved in developing the aircraft, which was hardly a recipe for leanness and speed of decision-making. In September 1957, the Marines announced that they were dropping G-134 because the Navy wanted to spend the money on tanker aircraft to equip their fleet carriers. The Marines would have to find some other mechanism for close support, like a bayonet or perhaps a jaunty and slightly offensive song. The Marines' loss was the Army's gain, as the procurement was now considerably simplified. The eventual test article for G134 became known as YAO-1F. It was a small, mid-wing monoplane with two 960 shaft horsepower Lycoming T-53 turboprops driving Hamilton's standard three-bladed propellers. Its most distinctive feature, though, was the bug-eyed cockpit, required to furnish the pilot and observer an unobstructed view of the world below them. Front cockpit windows were made of flat plates of inch-thick bulletproof glass and had one windshield wiper per side. The side windows hinged upwards to allow the crew to take their seats side by side in Martin Baker ejection seats. A deployable ladder made entry and exit simple. The ejection sequence caused a bit of a problem in early service as the navigator went out first, unbalancing the plane and leading to the pilot being shot out at a less than ideal angle. Modifications to the sequence eventually fixed this problem. You'll notice that at this stage the mock-up had a high T tail. Wind tunnel testing revealed that trimming the aircraft with one engine out would be impossible in this configuration unless powered controls were fitted. Since this would increase weight, complexity, and cost, the G134 was redesigned with the characteristic triple vertical tail in order to become the YAO-1F. This process was sufficiently complicated that it took nearly 2 years to build the first flying prototype. Curiously, this feature also substantially reduced the aircraft's frontal radar cross-section, making it one of the earliest low observables aircraft. Well, sort of, anyway. The prototype flew in April 1959 and immediately demonstrated excellent flying characteristics, besides rather heavy control surfaces, an issue that was easily fixed. It was fully aerobatic, particularly in roll, had a very short takeoff and landing run, and good endurance on internal fuel. 227 gallons of fuel was carried, giving about 2.5 hours of mission time. 150-gallon underwing drop tanks could, and typically would, be carried to extend that range to 4.5 hours. Instinctively, you might imagine the Mohawk to be quite a small aircraft, but it was actually not. Roughly the same size as an A4 Skyhawk, the OV-1A was 42 feet long with a wingspan just over 41 feet. Empty, it weighed about 11,000 pounds, and it could operate at up to 15,000 pounds at maximum load. Maximum speed in the production aircraft was limited to 297 miles an hour, and service ceiling was 25,000 feet. Performance-wise, it was a slower but faster climbing P-40E Warhawk. Flight testing was generally relatively uneventful until during a high-speed run to 460 miles an hour, the center fin abruptly detached. The aircraft was safely landed, and although the service limitation on speed was 297 miles an hour, reinforcement was added, fixing the problem. The Army Aviation Board was very happy with YAO-1F and recommended it for production. Each example cost about $435,000 in 1960. It was initially to be called Montauk, after a Native American tribe that lived near Grumman's Base in Long Island. The Army decided that the peaceful Montauks were neither well known enough or aggressive enough for a military aircraft. They therefore decided to name the OV-1 the Mohawk. When it arrived in service in the middle of 1961, the Mohawk was the first turboprop aircraft in the Army's inventory, and it replaced relatively sedate observation aircraft dating back to the Second World War. Unsurprisingly, it immediately established a reputation as a hot aircraft that offered the pilot a great deal of entertainment with a high degree of safety. It'd actually be the fastest climbing and highest climbing turboprop aircraft in the world for a good decade after its service entry. Usually the Mohawks would deploy with a pair of wing pylons to carry external tanks on. However, even though the Air Force said they couldn't, Mohawks did have the wing structure to carry up to 6 pylons on which could be hung iron bombs, 7 or 19 shot 2 3/4-inch rocket pods, and 50 caliber machine gun pods. The big 5-inch Zuni rocket could also be carried. The Army had 54 of its initial production run of OV-1A sent back to Grumman to have the pylons installed and a Mark 20 gun sight fitted for the pilot. These aircraft were briefly known as JOV-1A to distinguish them from the unarmed Mohawks. The Mohawk was an excellent close air support platform because of its tight turning circle, great visibility, and the fact that it was a relatively slow, stable gun platform that could place ordnance very precisely. Being as it was by definition orbiting near the forward edge of the battle area most of the time, the Mohawk's reaction time was also much better than tactical jets, which couldn't loiter as long either. It was also tough, with self-sealing fuel tanks and substantial armour for the crew. The Army loved all of this. It was exactly what they wanted and the troops on the ground needed. The Air Force hated it, and they kept pushing the DoD to tell the Army to stop, which they eventually agreed to do after successful use of the type in Vietnam had further irritated its sister service. The exception to this rule was when weapons were needed for self-defense. It seems like self-defense might be a regular need for a forward air controller in Vietnam, but there we are. And self-defense was, in fact, very much the order of the day in February 1968. Ken Lee's Mohawk was armed with two 50 caliber machine gun pods and two rocket pods. The MiG pilot made a fatal error, and in his hurry to re-engage, he pulled up right across the OV-1's path. Ken Lee let him have it with everything, pumping 50 caliber bullets into the Fresco from point-blank range. He also fired his 38 rockets in two salvos, largely by Kentucky windage as the Mohawk's gun sight had no air-to-air mode. Many 50 cal rounds, and by Lee's estimation, 4 2 3/4 inch rockets hit the MiG in the fuselage and wing. The MiG's engine flame disappeared as the two aircraft entered a low cloud bank. Lee lost track of the MiG for 5 seconds, reacquiring it as both aircraft exited the clouds. Its right wing was low and the nose was pitched over, with orange flames lapping the rear fuselage. The MiG went around one of the mountains, ringing the ash out, turning into what Lee knew was a blind valley. He was so low, though, that he knew he couldn't get out of the valley without impacting the hillside, and so he didn't see the MiG crashing. The Army had always intended the Mohawk to be fitted with advanced sensors that enabled it to detect enemy formations in all weathers and from standoff range. The first major variant of the aircraft was therefore fitted with an advanced Motorola AN/APS-94 side-looking airborne radar, mounted asymmetrically in an 18-foot fiberglass pod under the starboard side of the forward fuselage. To restore climbing performance because of the aerodynamic and weight compromises of the pod, the Mohawk's wingspan was extended 5 feet to 47 feet 10.5 inches. Data from the radar was recorded on a roll of film and processed in the cockpit. That processing took between 10 and 90 seconds depending on the size of the plot. That plot could then be viewed via a CRT display or sent back to a ground station for assessment. Flying at 3,000 feet, the Mohawk could cover an area of 50 miles on each side of the flight path. On a typical mission, it could map about 30,000 square kilometers. The first OV-1B models were deployed to South Korea in 1963 to monitor the demilitarized zone. The B was successful in Vietnam and was used extensively to monitor the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The other basic model of the Mohawk was the OV-1C, which had infrared rather than radar sensors. This was the most common variant of the Mohawk, with 169 built. It cost about 20% more to buy than the B. Early OV-1C aircraft were simply modified A model airframes that carried the UAS-4 Red Haze infrared sensor and a data communications link. Later examples moved the sensor suite into a pod underneath the fuselage just behind the wing, known as the AAS-14. This also included panoramic cameras for reconnaissance and, slightly unusually, a rotating anti-collision beacon, just in case the crew wanted to attract the attention of everyone in a 10-mile radius. Most C models had the extended wing from the B. Some also had a Ka-60 panoramic camera in the nose. This was retrofitted to some OV-1As in Vietnam as well. This photo shows the observer's cockpit in a later OV-1C. You can see the multiple hooded screens that allowed him to view the feeds from the various cameras in the dark. The Red Haze IR system was used to detect heat sources at night. It didn't have much utility during daylight. The OV-1s initially operating in Vietnam had the early UAS-4, but were soon upgraded to the more advanced versions as the need to monitor and interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail at night became a significant strategic need. AAS-14 was significantly more sensitive, allowing the aircraft to operate at higher altitudes and to cover a larger area. The aircraft's low noise signature and data link was a powerful combination in this effort, as the crew could identify a target and relay images and position within seconds. In 1967, Grumman modified two OV-1Bs and two OV-1Cs under the Southeast Asia Mohawk requirement, a program otherwise known as Seymour. This was a highly classified effort that was intended to accelerate the development of two technologies: forward-looking infrared or FLIR sensors and image intensification night vision goggles. The Seymour aircraft had other systems like a radar warning receiver to protect themselves, but the principal purpose was testing of night fighting optics. Project cost was in the region of $6 million or $1.5 million per aircraft, but I think that cost includes underlying development, so it isn't necessarily all hardware. The original idea was also to integrate the SLAR and the B models with the FLIR to create a true multi-sensor aircraft, but this was never done. The last Mohawk version to enter production was the OV-1 D, featuring a more powerful T-53L701 engine, improved avionics, and interchangeable mission pallets that made it possible to switch the aircraft from infrared to radar configuration in about an hour. It also had a number of additional cameras in addition to the nose-mounted panoramic unit. The D has a slightly different cockpit arrangement than the earlier models, with the central bank of gauges for the pilot replaced with the creatively named Vertical Instrument Display System. The first four OV-1Ds were prototypes converted from earlier production airframes, and the first of those flew in 1969. They were followed by 37 new-build aircraft, the last of which was delivered in December 1970. The OV-1D was a nearly $2 million aircraft, far more expensive than its predecessors. The first Mohawk unit deployed to Nha Trang in September 1962 to provide air support to Republic of Vietnam forces. In a sign of things to come, rules of engagement were very strict. The aircraft could only carry machine gun pods, which could only be used in self-defense, and the observer had to be Vietnamese. Even so, their deployment was highly successful, particularly as a result of the intelligence on troop movements and dispositions they were able to collect. Even the machine gun pods caused a storm of protest from the Air Force. The Army wanted to go a step further and have the Mohawks carry rockets, bombs, and napalm so they could break up enemy formations that they located deep behind the lines. And eventually rockets were routinely carried. By the summer of 1965, there were 30 Mohawks in the theatre, covering all of the major variants. At the Battle of Nha Trang, they provided essential visual reconnaissance and directed artillery. In August, the SLAR-equipped aircraft spotted ingress points for the Marines during Operation Starlight. And in December, they began to participate in Operation Tiger Hand, the interdiction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. B and C models were particularly in demand for this mission, locating targets for C-130 flare ships to illuminate. IR missions were especially dangerous, exposing the Mohawk to ground fire if they were detected. The pilots flew at 1,500 feet or lower, getting as close to the ground as they could to fly their searches. At low altitude, the IR in the belly of the aircraft could cover a strip about 500 meters wide. Flying in the early hours of the morning, they worked with Air Force B-57 Canberra light bombers loitering off the coast. Once they detected targets, they would give the B-57s the coordinates via a special tactical frequency, and they would come in and drop ordnance blind. The pilot of the Mohawk operated the plane's full range of radios during these missions: FM, HF, VHF, and UHF, while the observer kept tabs on the targets below. Quiet, fast, and rugged, compared to a helicopter at least, the Mohawk crews proved their aircraft's worth time and time again. The North Vietnamese called them Whispering Death because their approach was often too quiet to detect and their attacks were as precise as they were unexpected. SLAR was a real game changer as well. The aircraft could cruise along the DMZ and spot targets well inside North Vietnam. North Vietnamese SA-2 guideline batteries would often engage the Mohawks from across the DMZ to attempt to stop them. Fortunately, even though the Mohawks lacked a radar warning receiver, the missile guidance radar betrayed its presence by painting lines of interference across the SLAR display. Only one Mohawk was lost to a guideline in 1966, although details on this shootdown are pretty sparse. Radar warning systems were installed on the aircraft in 1969. Other sources have a Mohawk being lost to a MiG-17 that came over the border in 1969. I found no details at all about this. The VPAF didn't claim an OV-1 air-to-air kill in 1969. US Army fixed-wing aviation losses are also hard to come by in general. In all, 27 Mohawks were lost to enemy action, 25 of those to ground fire, 38 more were destroyed in operational accidents. Even so, the Mohawk had the highest availability rate of any US fixed-wing aircraft deployed to Southeast Asia. They were in constant demand and constant use. The Mohawk was also cheap to run, costing only about $200 per flight hour. That's about 30% that of a Phantom and comparable to the very efficient Northrop Freedom Fighter. And the Mohawk was significantly more advanced from an avionics perspective than the F-5A or C. It was a specialized but highly effective aircraft that fit a mission need the Air Force had rejected in its quest for speed and nuclear attack. If war had broken out in Europe, then the likelihood is that Mohawks would have been an important force multiplier in Germany, albeit the intensity of the threat from Shilkers and Manpads might have made its life expectancy that bit shorter. When the two Mohawks returned to Fubai Air Base, Lee found numerous 23mm cannon holes in his aircraft. He had shot through all his rockets and most of the 50 cal ammunition. Although they couldn't be completely sure, there was little doubt that he'd downed the MiG. But because the Army wanted to avoid any issues the Air Force might have with a Mohawk, or in fact any other Army aircraft shooting down an enemy, Lee and his wingman were ordered to keep his victory quiet. Confirmation would come some months later. Ken Lee had previously flown to Ubon Air Base in Thailand several times to meet with Robin Olds and Chappie James, who were interested in any Laotian targets identified by Lee and his fellow Mohawk pilots. The next time he made that trip, the two colonels pulled him aside. Olds and James informed Ken that the MiG killers confirmed, but they wouldn't say how they knew. All Ken Lee got from the Army was, "Don't talk about it, even if asked." It certainly is one of the more unusual MiG kills that occurred during the Vietnam War, although not in fact unique. A similar incident had occurred about 9 months earlier. On the 1st of May 1967, a flight of A-4 Skyhawks launched from US Bonhomme Richard to attack Kep Airfield north of Hanoi. Part of their Crusader escort had to divert, leaving the Skyhawks underprotected. Lieutenant Commander Theodore Swartz was leading the flak suppression flight and was about to make his attack when his wingman alerted him to a pair of MiG-17s moving in to attack from his 6 o'clock. Swartz, a former Crusader pilot, aborted his target run and pulled his aircraft into a high-G barrel roll to defend himself. The unexpected maneuver caused the attacking MiGs to overshoot, and Swartz slid into their 6 o'clock position. Without time to switch to guns, he fired a salvo of Zuni rockets. One of the 5-inch Zunis hit the MiG, which disintegrated in a ball of flame. Although an aircraft like the Mohawk initially looks like quite an easy target, it's low and slow, and in this case, it's unawares. Attacking something like this in a MiG-17 is actually a little more challenging than you might think. The MiG-17's radar lead computing gun sight was unlikely to be able to track the Mohawk against ground clutter, so the pilot would have been forced to make his attack without it. My understanding is that the best way to execute that attack would have been to maintain airspeed and break off early to prevent an overshoot. That leads to a 200 knot or so closure speed. If the pilot's intention was to engage with his full battery of two 23mm and a 37mm cannon, then effective range is about 800 meters. The Mohawk is a small target and probably quite difficult to see against the terrain, so maybe you can start firing at 500 in reality. With 100 meters per second of closure, you're looking at 2 seconds of firing time before you need to break off and climb to start again. Given the slow fire rate of the MiG's cannons, that isn't actually a great opportunity to hit the target unless you're an exceptionally good shot. You'd need to be very disciplined in order to execute an attack in that window and not get overexcited and overshoot. Most VPAF pilots were inexperienced. They weren't good shots as a rule, and they were often either excessively aggressive or excessively timid. In this case, the pilot made an obvious mistake and pressed his attack too close in. Having overshot, he then appears to have attempted to climb to re-engage rather than going to full throttle and separating. This gave Ken Lee the opportunity to unload everything, which he did. If he had just been carrying 50 cal machine guns, then the effects would have likely been less spectacular, given the MiG-17's ability to absorb machine gun fire. But of course he had the rockets, each of which hit with the force of 80 20mm cannon rounds from the common US M39, and that was all she wrote. The Mohawk continued in service into the early 1990s. Some aircraft went out to the Middle East for Desert Storm before the type was retired in 1992. No Iraqi MiGs were down.